Hello, Nick.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm very well. I'm extremely well. Thank you so much for coming to this podcast. I've read your latest book, which I've got here, Who Owns Football? The Changing Face of Club Ownership. I would highly recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I do have a few questions about it as well, um, about ownership and whatnot. But before we get into it, just a brief word about yourself, who you are, and why you actually decided to write the book.
Yeah, so my day job is as a staff writer for The Athletic. Before I joined them, I was a freelancer for uh, God, how long was it? 6, 8 years, 7 years, 8 years. When I worked for The Guardian and ESPN and Football 365 and pretty much anyone else who'd pay me really. Um, I've been talking about this book with a few people, but the starting point where I started to a get enthused about it and also form some of the kind of theories or not theories, some of the ideas that would go through the book was when I went to a game in Austria which was covering for the Athletic, which was the first game between Red Bull Salzburg and Austria Salzburg, or the new version of Austria Salzburg, which was the club that Red Bull took over in Salzburg in 2005 to sort of um, start their kind of colossal football empire that we now know all about. Um, and that kind of made me think about the idea of what constitutes a good owner and what's a bad owner. I think we all kind of have a fairly decent idea of what a bad owner might be. It's depending on point of view, it's either someone who doesn't spend money or, broadly speaking, will put the interests of the club secondary to their own, or leaves the club in some kind of financial catastrophe. Um, but from a kind of fairly objective perspective, if you're just looking at how Red Bull have run Red Bull Salzburg in the nearly 20 years now since they arrived, they are kind of objectively good. They have turned that team into not just kind of perennial Austrian champions, but they've made them sort of semi-regulars in the Champions League. They have been this kind of incredible proving ground for a huge amount of talent. You kind of think of some of the players that have been through Red Bull Salzburg is extraordinary. Erling Haaland, Sadio Mane, Dominic Szoboszlai. But from the other perspective, from the perspective of the original fans of Austria Salzburg, the club that they took over, they have basically turned what a community institution and the football club that all these people supported for all their whole lives into an advertising vehicle for a fizzy drinks company. So I became kind of quite interested in the idea of what constitutes a good football club owner, given that it's really kind of open to interpretation, and it's kind of depends on your own point of view, and depends on your own circumstances. So in a kind of that's a very sort of long-winded answer to quite a simple question, but from that point, that was where I got started to get sort of enthusiastic and could form some of the ideas that are in the book.
So let's start with that then. Obviously, there's different people have different opinions on this. With regards to yourself, what do you think makes a good owner? And when you were interviewing people for this book, what common themes did they come up with when you asked them that question?
I think the thing that came up quite a lot was a good owner is an owner who's kind of honest about their intentions. So, if they are in it to um for their for their own kind of purposes, if they are upfront about it, then people don't mind quite so much. It's the sort of the dishonesty that and um people who make big promises that they can't deliver, though they're the kind of things that will kind of will constitute a bad owner, or at least an unpopular owner. I think one of the interesting things that I did was I sort of conducted a sort of semi-scientific survey of I think it was about 1,500 fans that responded and asked them what their favoured sort of kind of structure of club ownership would be. What would be their favoured owner of their club, and by a very really very long way, the winner was fan ownership, which is interesting because it's one of those kind of it's almost a sort of utopian ideal of of club ownership, because the theory is the people who are making decisions about your football club are the ones that care about your football club and have its best interests at heart, whereas financial speculators or people who are in it for the kind of ego trip perhaps don't have everyone's best the club's best interests at the forefront of their minds. Um, the kind of the interesting thing about that is that the highest in the English football pyramid anyway, the highest club that is truly sort of fan owned is Exeter City, and it's quite difficult to imagine any club that is fan owned from getting above them, above the level they're at in League One, um, just simply because of the kind of the financial pressures and the financial necessities of taking a club much higher than that in the pyramid. So while I think most fans have said they would like club ownership, there is a sort of natural ceiling on that, and it, it's also the case that fan ownership will most often come in when the club itself is in sort of peril of some description, usually financial, and it's just needs someone in to kind of mop up everything when no one else will want to bother. And that's what happened to Wrexham. The club were in a lot of financial trouble. A fan ownership group came in, but then the team sort of stagnated and didn't get promoted, and were kind of, I think, almost relegated once or twice. So the enthusiasm for the fan ownership, the ideals that maybe some of the fans had in mind, started to wane as the success on the pitch, or the you know the performance on the pitch declined. And now that they have two very famous, very wealthy men owning them, and they're taking them up the league, and you wouldn't be surprised if they were, in the Premier League in a few years. There aren't that many people kind of pining for the days of fan ownership at Wrexham now, I don't think.
Sticking, I was going to ask this later, but seeing as you're on the topic, talk about it now. In regards to fan ownership, is it very um, euphoric and almost utopic in terms of how people think about it? In the sense of, yes, they'll hark back to what they consider golden days, where it was almost like that. It probably wasn't, but that's what they think. And then now take it over, and actually they realise that they need to understand the economics more. They need to understand the reality of getting basically organised as a football club. Isn't that one of the major problems with fan ownership that it runs into? That actually, but they have the euphoria in their heads is actually when they get to like the reality of it, it's not quite that simple.
Yeah, because basically, I mean, as I sort of half mentioned before, the amount of money it takes to kind of to ascend to a particularly high level in the English football pyramid is just unrealistic for fan owners. There have been successful examples of fan ownership. Luton were fan owned for quite a while, but again, that was kind of broadly when they were at a fairly low ebb, and they took them up a couple of sort of steps in the division, but it wasn't that wasn't their structure when they did actually get promoted to the Premier League. Portsmouth were fan owned for a little while, and they actually there was a sort of democratic vote from the Portsmouth supporters, or some of the supporters trust, to transfer their ownership from the fans structure to the people that own them now, which is the CEO or former CEO of Disney. So there is a kind of utopian idea about because it's like it's like you or I are making decisions about our football club, and we would never, make decisions that were self-centered or not in the interests of the club or the fans. But yeah, the realities are often don't match that. And in fairness, as I said, with examples like Wrexham and Portsmouth, what you will often get is a recognition of that it might be great for fans to own the club for a while, but there's a recognition that there is a ceiling to that, and in some cases, um, the clubs have moved away from that structure.
So two countries where they have fan ownership a lot is Germany and Spain. And especially with Germany, everyone's again saying, "Oh, this is wonderful how they're doing it," and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying there isn't any advantages to it, but actually, are there any disadvantages to it as well? And is the reality as brilliant as people seem? So, for example, you have this 50+1 rule in Germany, but Bayern Munich, apart from last season when Bayer Leverkusen did a season which no one expected, Bayern Munich basically dominate the league. So does it always work out? And the same with Spain. Yes, they'll have what Barcelona do. I'm not sure if Real do, but Barcelona certainly do, and other clubs do as well, especially Basque. But really, when it comes to the league, only three teams have a chance. And I think the last time outside of Atletico, Real, and Barcelona won the league was, I think, Valencia in 2004.
Yeah, 2004. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So again, how realistic? Basically, the reality of fan ownership in those countries is it basically as good as what people say?
It's interesting because I mean, when I've been talking about fan ownership now, I have been. I should have sort of maybe clarified this. I was talking about fan ownership, which is broadly there's a broad structure of it in England, whereby it is actually fans who are making day-to-day decisions and running the club. They are kind of appointing managers. They are making decisions about stadium and so on. In Germany and Spain, while they are different structures, it's obviously not the same as that. What the form of fan ownership there is that the people who well, certainly in Spain, elections are held every 3 or 4 years to decide who the president is, and beyond that, the fans don't really have much of a say in the running of the club at all. What's quite interesting is that this week there is quite sort of significant talk that Real Madrid are going to move away from that. Socios is the term that is used in Spain. Move away from that structure and bring in at least some outside investment, which would, I mean, it would require a sort of change in the law for them to be able to shift their ownership structure. Um, it's also a sort of similar case in Brazil, which is changing which has changed a few years ago, where previously it's not quite fan ownership, but previously clubs were owned or clubs were run as sort of sporting associations, like members clubs, basically. And again, there were so many clubs that were in financial problems that again a change to the law was required. So now you have lots of different people kind of coming in and investing. But yes, as you say, there is. It's tricky to know whether it is a sort of natural kind of extension of the ownership structure, but you do get you get situations where the financial element is sort of stratified, where, as you say, Bayern Munich are completely dominant. Not only do they win the league most years, but they're able to basically buy the best players from the team in second. There was a spell where they kind of not only beat Borussia Dortmund, but they kept nicking their best players like Mario Götze and Robert Lewandowski. So that is a kind of a certainly a kind of drawback to it, and the reason it is kind of it is stratified is that you're not able to have a situation like Manchester City or Chelsea where someone very rich from the outside comes in and kind of pumps a load of money in and turns the club in, turns a previously sort of middling or struggling club into a super club. Um, it is possible for people to invest in clubs in Germany. The 50 plus one rule only dictates that that kind of fans, however you want to define that, and there are some quite loose definitions of what that means in some clubs in Germany, Red Bull, RB Leipzig in particular. Um, that rule only kind of ensures that the majority of the control of the club is in the hands of the fans. So people are allowed to invest. It's just that people don't often want to because they know that they won't have full kind of control and they won't be able to control the destiny of their investment really. So yeah, as you say, that there are great advantages, and it is again it's seen as a sort of as an ideal. People often in England are often very jealous of how things work in Germany, but in practice it often doesn't quite work as it's intended.
I wonder, I don't know this, but I wonder if in Brazil, one of the reasons the law was changed maybe was because of hooliganism as well. Because at least I think apparently South America it was still relatively rife there, especially not Argentina as well.
I don't think that the main basically the main the sort of motivation was that these clubs just didn't have any money. There were a couple of clubs at the real at the sort of top of the financial tree over there that were probably always going to be fine. They're big enough and they produce enough players that they can sell to Europe essentially. That they will probably, unless something disastrous happens, be financially okay. But the teams on a kind of lower level were just in so much financial trouble from because they didn't have those kind of income streams and because they couldn't rely on being able to sell players as regularly, and they also were trying spending beyond their means, trying to keep up with the bigger clubs. So you had a situation where these were kind of not quite amateur associations, but they weren't um, they weren't set up. Certainly the teams in the kind of lower reaches of the league weren't set up to challenge the higher clubs in the same way in a kind of financial sense. So the change in the law there was at least in part an attempt to kind of level that out a little bit, and also to to uh, sort of boost sort of the standing of some of these clubs on the world scale. If outside investors have come in, and there have been a number of investors from outside Brazil that have come in and put money into these clubs, then that, in theory, at least, it's a little probably a little bit too early to sort of properly see whether that has worked, as this rule was only changed in 2021. But again, that's one of the theories behind why that law change was put in place.
Okay. So let's have a brief history of the fan ownership. So how is it? Obviously, there's a lot more money that's come into the game, and there's various sort of things that have spawned off this because of that. But even putting that to one side for a minute, how else has fan ownership changed in England and the rest of Europe in the last, say, 50, 60 years?
Fan ownership, or just club ownership
No, so just
generally?
ownership in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, the it all. If you wanted to kind of put a sort of like a year zero date as to when everything started to change, it was in the early 1980s when um at that point, well, until the 1970s, um the people that, in inverted commas, owned the football club were the chairman and the directors, who would have shares in the club, but they weren't really allowed to sort of financially benefit from those shares, or really, I mean, until I forget what the exact date was, but there were rules in place that you couldn't even really draw a salary from that position, and it was basically to all intents and purposes, voluntary position, which had its advantages, but it wasn't that the advantages weren't primarily financial. Those rules were kind of relaxed, and then but you still weren't allowed to, for example, put a football club on the stock market. in the 1980s, the early 1980s, Irving Scholar, who was kind of invited onto the Tottenham board, started buying up shares, and he got around the rules in a kind of um, a devilishly simple way by he simply formed a holding company that was called Tottenham. I think it was just called Tottenham Hotspur PLC. That holding company owned the football club, so but they floated the holding company on the stock market, so they made all this money without actually technically breaking the rules. And then from that point, that's when it took a few years for that sort of thing to change. I mean, even as I think I write in the one of the first chapters in the book, even at the start of the Premier League, which is seen as this kind of year zero, this was the point at which money took over and English football changed completely. Of the 22 clubs in the Premier League, 21 of the owners, in again inverted commas, the chairman of all these football clubs, were all English. Mostly they were from local areas. Mostly they were sort of, I hesitate to say normal people because they were all kind of wealthier than I. And if I'm not, I don't want to guess about your financial situation, Chris, but I would say they're probably richer than you as well. So uh, so they weren't like you regular Joe on the street, but they did actually, at least there was at least a kind of person that you could identify. There was some semblance of humanity there, rather than a sort of relatively faceless corporation or investment vehicle or whatever is owning the club. Um, the only exception to the idea of all locals owning these clubs was Sam Haman, who owned Wimbledon, and he was from Lebanon, but he had moved to South London quite a few years before he became involved in Wimbledon, so he wasn't exactly a kind of financial speculator or a blow-in. And yeah, the way that it has all changed, and it did stay that like that for a few more years. It was there was in the 90s was this kind of curious time in the Premier League where there was a lot of money coming in, but the way that football was being run was still had significant elements of amateurism, which depending on your point of view, was either infuriating or quite charming. But it didn't really start properly changing until the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And then, of course, the other big sort of seismic event was Roman Abramovich arriving in 2003. From that moment, it was you'd obviously had wealthy people putting money into their football clubs and allowing them to gain great success from that point. Jack Walker at Blackburn Rovers obviously won the league in 1995, but someone like Abramovich coming in with theoretically limitless wealth and limitless resources was the kind of great game changer and has kind of precipitated a lot of the changes that have happened over the last 20 years.
Was Abramovich the first foreign owner of an English club? I know you had Sam Man, but
Sam Haman, yeah, there would have there were there would have been a few more before that. Um, I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly who. Well, someone you take someone like Milan Mandaric, who I think he was from Croatia, one of the Baltic countries. So, and he owned here in Portsmouth before that. So Abramovich wasn't the first foreign or non-British person to own an English football, top flight English football club, but he was certainly the first person that had these kind of significant means that obviously um, Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Mansour is coming at Manchester City, and Saudi Arabia at Newcastle, and so on. That's all kind of precipitated from that point, but to the point where there are now only a handful of clubs that are sort of wholly and fully owned by, if you like, local people.
you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and obviously you could talk about Qatar in this moment. But what's your opinion on these, like technically, technically let's say they're not, but essentially state-owned football clubs? What is your opinion on that? Yeah, and basically, do you think it can last? Do you think the rules will change to stop that happening in the future?
Um, well, I mean, my personal opinion is that even if you separate the kind of moral problems with a state like Saudi Arabia and the reasons that they might own a football club. I don't think a nation state should should be in control of a football club at all, um, simply because it's not possible for they are inherently owning the football club. They're owning a what should be a kind of local community institution that should exist purely to be a football club, and they're using that for their own means. Whether you kind of agree with their means or intentions or not, I don't think it's right that a nation state can use a football club for the kind of geopolitical reasons that it has. I mean, one of the it just excuse me, on a very slight tangent, one of the things I write about in the book is PSG and why Qatar, technically QSI, the Qatari Sports Investment, still own PSG is is as a sort of connection to Europe and as a sort of geopolitical protection against some of the countries that surround them. That's not and maybe I'm a little bit old and maybe I'm a little bit idealistic about these things, but it doesn't feel like what a football club should be. It doesn't feel like that's what the purpose of a football club should be. In terms of kind of rules that are in place, there are rules that are in place. Like technically speaking, Saudi Arabia do not own Newcastle, or so they're told the Premier League. Technically speaking, Newcastle is owned by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which they have managed to reassure the authorities in England is not directly influenced by anyone in the Saudi government. Which, and if you believe that, you believe anything, kind of thing. So there are rules in place, sure that they could be those rules could be strengthened, they could be tightened, but as that example shows, and as the Tottenham example that I talked about before shows, the problem with these rules is that where there is enough there is enough to be gained for someone somewhere along the lines, that they will always figure out a way around those rules. People will always kind of be able to get to circumvent them and do essentially whatever they want. So yeah, in short, I don't think that states should be allowed to own English football clubs. It's the problem being that it's very, very difficult to stop them as things are structured at the moment.
Yeah. And then you have the other end of the scale where you have clubs which are so poor and so lacking economic viability that they basically go bust. What is the rate of clubs that have gone bust over the last, say, 30 years? Because when I was, in fact, I don't think I was even a teenager, it must have been before. I remember, was it Aldershot, I think it was, that went bust in the early 90s. So, how many clubs have gone bust since then? And for what reasons?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the thing about the extraordinary thing about football is that people think of it as a business now, and you'll get people very kind of sincerely and solemnly saying, of course, football's a business these days, but it doesn't operate like any other business, in as much as the entities within it that fail don't really disappear or go out of existence. You mentioned Aldershot. There's also Darlington, which went out of existence, and I think the most recent one, unless I've forgotten something mad here, is Bury, who went out of existence. And even then, when that happens, then Phoenix clubs will kind of rise in their place, and there is a team called Bury that is playing in a very low level at the moment, but they wear the same. I think they wear the same colours. They play at Gig Lane. To all intents and purposes, they look like Bury. So it's a sort of it's a very strange industry. But in Bury's case, it was just it's like the thing people say about when a nuclear factory or a nuclear power plant or something, when there's a nuclear meltdown, it's not one thing going wrong, it's like 9 different things going wrong that affects each other. And that's what the case is with when football clubs go out of existence. It's not one bad owner; it's a number of bad owners that are sort of strung together, and that's what happened to Bury. They were eventually in the hands of a guy called Steve Dale, who just was essentially completely out of his depth in terms of how to run a football club. He essentially stripped the whole entity for parts and didn't really care when it went out of existence. And that was the consequence of a number of things kind of going wrong, a number of bad owners down the years, rather than just kind of one thing going badly.
Celebrity owners, well, celebrities by their very nature have a certain status in society. Whether you agree with that status or not, they have that culturally. So, why on earth would you buy a football club with all the pressure that
Hmm.
brings?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, in the there are a few reasons really, and the one, I mean, the most obvious example of a celebrity owner around at the moment is Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney at Wrexham. They got into it because they were sort of, I mean, there is this slightly romantic story about Rob McElhenney watching Sunderland Till I Die over lockdown and kind of identifying with the working class spirit of the Sunderland fans and thinking, well, I want to make a documentary about that and like that, but of my own club, which is kind of partly the case. They did partly buy Wrexham for content. They bought Wrexham to be the kind of the set of a documentary that has proved to be extremely successful. But the sort of financial reason that they bought it is because investing in a sports team in the US is prohibitively expensive. If you want to have a club at the top level, if you want to have a club in the NFL or MLB, NBA or whatever, you have to buy a team that's already there, and that is, it's too. You have to sort of start at $2 or $3 billion, which is obviously ludicrous. What is attractive to them and to other US investors is the idea of promotion, where you can buy a club at a very low level, and in theory, if you put enough money in and you do things right, and you make enough sensible decisions over the years, you can take that club up to the top level, at which point it will have appreciated in value. In theory, you can make a lot of money from that. Um, but yeah, that's the theory that, or the main motivation for celebrity owners now. I don't know if you want to include David Beckham as a celebrity owner with Inter Miami. I mean, he was one of the terms of his contract when he played for LA Galaxy was that he would be paid a certain amount of money, but he'd also would be given the option of buying a franchise license for a very cheap, relatively cheap anyway price. So I think it was about $25 million. Where and when you consider that clubs are going for 500 million, way north of that now in MLS, it's it's a complete bargain. And then but then if you go further back, you have celebrity owners like Elton John at Watford, who didn't take over Watford really for any other reason than um, he was a Watford fan and he wanted to see if he could make a success out of them, which he did. Took them from the fourth division, this kind of decrepit football club that no one really cared about, and they finished second in the first division and runner up in the FA Cup final. So, yeah, that's another another thing that's kind of changed drastically over the years. It's become more and more difficult for an individual to buy a football club unless they have limitless sources of wealth.
One of the things which you don't talk about in the book, but I'm interested to get your thoughts on it, is ex-players buying football clubs. And the obvious example of that is Salford City,
Yeah.
with some of the Man United players doing that. And they've done well. I think they're in eighth and ninth tier. They're now in League One, I believe.
Hmm.
Why do you, and they bought that, I think it was over 10 years ago. So why do you think other ex-players haven't looked at that and thought, actually, that could be something that we do? Why do you think they've not done that?
Why do you think more people don't do that, or why, um,
Why do you, seeing the success that those Man U players have with Salford City, why have more ex-players decided? Well, why hasn't that happened with other ex-players? Like get a group of them together and actually buy a non-league club and try and do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the one of the reasons is that it's a lot of hassle to run a football club, and you know, um, if you are a footballer who's done very well over their career, you don't necessarily need that stress. So that will be one reason. Another reason is that a lot of players will not will prefer to be, if they want to be involved in the game, they prefer to be a manager. So they, you know, they want to be in a situation where they're still kind of involved in the kind of the not grassroots is the wrong word, but they are involved in the kind of the actual football rather than the business side of it, and they're not risking any of their money if they're a manager. That it can be a very lucrative business being a football manager. Um, but it is becoming a little bit more common. It's like, for example, Ronaldo, the Brazilian Ronaldo, was the owner of Real Valladolid in Spain. I think he's now sold. He certainly was going to sell Real Valladolid. I'm not sure whether he actually has sold it at this point. He also owned Cruzeiro in Brazil for a couple of years and sold them earlier on this year and made a sort of nice profit on that. There's kind of plenty of talk. There's about Beckham, as we discussed. There's plenty of talk about other players kind of getting involved in football ownership. I think it's partly because they see the example of a lot of people in a lot of sports people in the US um, getting involved in this kind of thing. Like Magic Johnson is involved in ownership of a few different sports teams. Derek Jeter, the former New York Yankees player, is involved in ownership, and LeBron James is already kind of investing in various elements of that. He's a stakeholder in FSG, the obviously the organisation that owns Liverpool. So I think you are seeing you haven't seen it as much before, partly because, as I said, people when they retire from their playing careers get into coaching and managing rather than ownership. But you are now you're also not that these players are using all their own money to kind of invest in. You are now seeing a generation of players who have this enormous wealth from the money that they've earned over their playing career that that now sort of see themselves as businessmen rather than just footballers or former footballers. Um, so yeah, and there have been examples before, like Terry Venables basically tried to do something like this, not terribly successfully with some of the investments that he made, but yeah, it is a kind of it isn't mentioned in the book. I think it's a little bit of a. I'm trying to sell this book, but it's a little bit of a flaw with the book, and it basically only came about because it only wasn't included. I had planned to include a chapter on that, but a series of interviews that I had planned didn't that basically fell through and didn't happen. So it was one of those. A couple of the sections of the book I felt I could write without speaking directly to people involved in it, but I didn't feel that I could properly write a section about former footballers becoming owners without speaking directly to the relevant people. And for various reasons, I couldn't get access to those people.
You talk in the book about ownership of female football clubs, especially from a US perspective. And we talked about celebrities earlier. A lot of celebrities got involved with that. So Natalie Portman being an example with
Mm.
Angel City.
Angel City, yeah.
With First of all, how's that developed in the US? Because in terms of sports marketing, although I think England's UK's improved a lot, the US is still number one. I'll say in terms of sports marketing. So how's it developed in the US? And secondly, how's it developed in Europe in general? What are the main differences between the two areas?
Well, I think the from that perspective, the advantage that the US had is that women's football has always been taken more seriously in the US than it has historically in the UK. As you say, we're getting better now, but I think we kind of most of us know the history of how women's football has been treated in England and Europe more broadly. So from a publicity and business perspective, that's a kind of immediate advantage, given that the US national women's team has been so successful over the years, won a number of World Cups. It's for a while. I don't know if it still is, but it was certainly the highest participation sport for young women and girls, um, rather than the kind of traditional, in inverted commas, US sports. Um, so that there is the kind of that advantage. But it's interesting what's happening in Europe. I think one thing that that is mentioned in the book that I think we may see in the coming years is where you'll have men's clubs, or you'll have established football clubs that are primarily concerned with the men's team. They have a women's team, but they don't really take them that seriously. Now, Manchester United are a perfect example of this. Jim Ratcliffe took over the football operations side of Manchester United, but he's made it pretty clear that he couldn't care less about the women's team, and he sort of seems to regard them as a bit of an irritant. So I think in those sorts of situations, I don't know about Manchester United specifically, I think you may see situations where the women's team is kind of almost sold off to outside investors, where it's almost like a franchise agreement where they'll keep the name and the kind of outside identity of the club. They'll keep, the colors and the name and badge and so on, but it will be run almost separately. You have kind of groups of investors that are kind of interested in that sort of structure and in that way of running women's football. Um, the people that you kind of speak to within women's football just see it as an enormous growth industry because there's just more room to grow into. You have a kind of an increasing audience, sort of partly inspired by the England women's team being so successful in the last few years. And you have a lot of people who currently involved in the game who don't necessarily take it as seriously as they should do. So there is scope for people who do take women's football seriously to come in and make those investments. There's a group that I talk about in the book called Mercury 13, who it's a little bit that they haven't done a huge amount yet, and they've got a lot of publicity, not least from me in the book, for that they're basically a multi-club group that currently only have one club, which is Como in Italy. But their plan is to expand kind of across Europe, and they've been talking to clubs in England and so on. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point they will take over the women's side of a kind of broader football club and see if they can kind of make a success of it that way.
So you've greatly, really good. You talked about multi-club groups because that's what we'll talk about next. Do you think that's something that will become more and more common? And actually, going back to buying football clubs in general, maybe it's two separate questions. Especially at the top end, it's getting more and more expensive to buy a football club. So let me split it into two parts. One, multi-club groups. Do you think that will become more common? And two, do you think you'll see a situation where instead of one person buying a whole club, a top club, you might get two, three investors, and they might work including each other. Similar to what happens with Aston Villa, I'll think a bit like that, two separate owners. Do you think that will happen more and more?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, in answer to the multi-club questions, absolutely, 100%, it will. I am not necessarily kind of in favor of it personally, but it will happen more and more. You there are enough clubs. If you take just the clubs in the Premier League at the moment, I can't remember what the exact number is now because it's all changed so quickly. But the majority of clubs in the Premier League are connected in some way to another, either football club or another sports team. So you have the biggest example being that City Football Group, which owns I think 13 clubs around the world now, or at least has either owns or has significant stakes in them. And this is sort of seen as I think it's the next big thing. It's the next thing that people do. Just owning one club isn't really enough for people anymore. There are a lot of kind of logical reasons that people put forward for owning football clubs, owning multiple clubs. You have the the economies of scale. Rather than having scouting departments at 5 different clubs, you can have a central scout department for all of them, and they can recommend different players to different clubs and so on. So there is an advantage there, and you will get another thing that big clubs like about multi-club structures is that they can move players fairly fluidly between them. Again, the high profile example being Savinho, who was brilliant at Girona last season when they looked like they were going to win the league for a lot of the season, and has now just moved to Manchester City. So um, you are going to see that a lot more. I've mentioned Brazil a couple of times. One of the things that I think is going to happen quite a lot is other multi-club groups moving into Brazil and buying some of the clubs there. Again, City Football Group have a club over there. Um, and yeah, it's going to happen. It's just going to happen more and more, which is kind of partly a consequence because the financial strength that the Premier League has and the type of people that the Premier League attracts for investors. In answer to the second question about groups of people coming in, yeah, absolutely, and as you kind of suggest, it is certainly at the top end of the Premier League. It's really the only way that people can afford to buy a football club these days. So, probably you mentioned Aston Villa, probably the most high profile example of that is Chelsea, where it's not. Todd Bowley is the kind of seems to be have become the like front man from this for this group, but it is actually a fairly disparate group of investors that he has brought together under the banner of Blueco, which are the company that actually owns Chelsea. So yeah, I mean Blueco weren't an existing entity before they came in; they were just a group of people. If you remember when it first became clear that Roman Abramovich was going to have to sell Chelsea, there were all these guys kind of elbowing each other out the way, trying to get in and take over Chelsea. What ultimately happened is a few of those people joined forces and came in. What will be quite interesting is in a few years if the problems that have arisen from that, and we're again using the Chelsea example, because they previously weren't, you know, necessarily business partners, and they just came together to simply to take over Chelsea. There's been a lot of disagreements. You get, different people involved in those structures briefing against the other people that theoretically supposed to be on their side, but they're kind of saying different things about the other side to the media. As I say, what will be interesting is if that discourages people from going down that road in the future, whether it will turn out to be kind of more trouble than it's worth. Ultimately, that will be governed by whether people still think they can make money that way, which is the ultimate point of anyone who has that amount of money is they want, generally speaking, they want to make more money. So it's really interesting to see how that kind of pans out in the next few years.
Beno Gaddafi, I think it was either him or his sons were close to owning Juventus way back when. Which is a weird tale in itself. And I remember hearing at the time thinking that's just crazy. It didn't go through. But what weird tales of football ownership have you heard? I know you
Oh,
put some in a book, but yeah, there must be some they didn't put in a book if it's too weird.
yeah, I mean that was one of my favorite chapters of the book to write. Yeah, Conor Gaddafi. I mean, Conor Gaddafi. You mentioned Juventus. There was talk of him trying to own Crystal Palace at one point, and Simon Jordan, who owned them at the time, kind of quite solemnly said, "Well, yes, I know this might prove controversial," and you're kind of going, "Oh, it might prove controversial, okay," but there is the kind of old line about football fans will accept pretty much anyone who owning their team if the team are winning, which Newcastle being the perfect example of that. But yeah, there are loads of kind of mad stories in the book about warlords and wanted war criminals owning football clubs. The one I particularly like is the guy at Doncaster, Ken Richardson, who who tried to burn down the stadium that Doncaster played in because he was basically he an interesting character to say the least. He tried to sell Doncaster ground. The slight problem there being that he didn't own the Doncaster ground; it was owned by the local council. So he came up with a wizard wheeze to burn down one of the stands, and either claim for it on the insurance or say, well, it's burned down now, so you might as well sell it, sell the land. And he employed a guy to set the stand on fire. Unfortunately, he didn't perhaps choose the brightest mind in the world to try and set this stand alight, because not only did he not succeed in burning the place down, he left a bag containing various fire lighting implements and his mobile phone at the scene of the crime. But just really to cover his tracks, he left. The last thing he did before leaving his mobile phone there was leave a message on Mr. Richardson's phone saying the job's done. So it's really a mystery as to how the police cracked the code in the end. But yeah, there are lots of other tales like that in the book, and yes, it was one of the more enjoyable chapters to write.
That's crazy. I mean, if you're gonna do it, at least hire someone who's
Yeah,
more competent in
yeah.
those things. Just mad. One more set, a few end, just a couple more questions. There is a sad end to football ownership, and there's a real sad chapter towards the end where you talk about what happens to football owners when they get it wrong. Obviously, it happens more at the lower end, but I mean, there's some real tragic tales that regard as well. People dying
Yeah, I
young.
mean, this is one of the things that I want to. One of the things that I really want to highlight in the book is the kind of, as I think I worded it, is the real world consequences of a bad football club owner. So we usually think of a bad football club owner in terms of the football club that they own doesn't do very well in the league, or they fail financially, but you don't really think about the people that affects. Just going back to the Berry example, there's a guy I spoke to in the book who if you've ever been around lower league football clubs, there's one of these guys at most clubs is the guy who basically does everything. The guy who he dealt with the program and he helped out the groundsman, and he was the kind of essentially the office manager, receptionist. He answered the phones, and he would do it for a lowish salary because he just loved not just football, but he loved the club. He loved Bury, and the way he was treated by Steve Dale towards the end is basically kind of kicked the enthusiasm and the love for football out of him. And that, of the things that I talk about in the book, that's on the kind of more milder scale of things. You have, there are people who face kind of financial ruin, essentially, because individuals who, partly because of bad management of the football club. The guy that I think I wrote about in the book, who was a Portsmouth fan, he was also a builder and kind of engineer, and the Portsmouth kind of got him in to do various jobs over the years to improve Fratton Park, and he ended up not getting paid for most of those jobs, and that sort of drove his business into the ground. Um, and so yeah, so there were kind of many more sort of tragic cases of the what actually happens on a human level to people when someone who you know either doesn't know what they're doing or doesn't or has malign intentions owns a football club.
In regards to football ownership, what are your views on the independent regulator that's going to be coming in possibly from next year?
It's interesting. I mean, I didn't write about that hugely in the book because at the time that I was writing it, it wasn't really clear what the scope, and I suppose it still isn't really clear what the scope and the sort of teeth that this regulator is going to have. I mean, in theory, it's a good idea. The Premier League are, most of the Premier League clubs are, as most rampant capitalists are, when regulation is mentioned, not happy about it because they just want to be kind of left alone to do whatever they've been doing and make as much money as they possibly can. But it's clear that football needs some kind of regulator, not just for financial reasons, but for kind of many other reasons. I don't know, to keep football for what I think is anyway is its kind of main purpose, which is to be the community institution, to be a kind of benefit to the communities that these clubs are in. The obvious issue is what sort of powers will the football regulator have? Will they actually be able to? They can bring in all the rules they want, and I kind of talked about this earlier on. If they are not able to legally enforce any of these things that they are talking about, or that they are in theory there to enforce, then it's basically useless. So uh, I think it's it's one of those things that I'm glad exists. I just we're just going to have to wait a couple of years to see whether it actually, in practical terms, is useful and whether it actually is going to have any kind of positive impact on the game.
Is it? I'm half and half with it in the sense that, from a distribution point of view, I can completely understand why. But from a legal and governmental perspective, I'm not sure. I don't know how else we do, but I'm not sure an independent regulator would be good because certainly a body like that, there's always a problem of overreach. Let's say they've been going on for 10 years, and then Premier League says, okay, then we'll include in the TV deal that the lower leagues will get a percentage of our rights to distribute down. Will a regulator there, because obviously you're going to have people working for it, will it stop there? Would it want to overreach another part? I don't know if you read, there was an article or something a couple of months ago where UEFA are starting to get worried because in their rules, as a government, you're not allowed to interfere with football. And there's a clause in the actual law that says a state can intervene or use it for certain things. And even support groups are saying we don't actually want that clause in there because then the government could use football as a political pardon the pun. So isn't there a danger with a regulator that actually there could be a bit of overreach, that once they've done their purpose and then it starts doing naturally, instead of going off into the night, they'll actually want to regulate more and more and more. And that could not only make it a state sport, which I necessarily wouldn't want, but also give the use. We talk about Saudi Arabia, but the government could use football as a political football in its own right.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think, but again, this is the it's one of those things that, in theory, is I think is a broadly positive thing, but it just depends on how it is kind of deployed and kind of who runs it. And you are, to a point, kind of relying on. Excuse me, sorry. You are, to a point, relying on an element of trust that the people involved aren't going to overreach. They aren't going to go beyond the kind of scope of what is the original intent. So again, it's one of those things that we just don't know what the kind of end goal of all this is going to be for another few years, and we'll just have to kind of wait and see. But yeah, I agree. There is that danger of overreach. There is that danger of the power being abused. I'd like to think it won't happen in this country anyway, but who knows really? I mean, again, it's going to be one of those things that we're going to need to wait for a few years to kind of figure out whether to figure out what the whether the theory actually kind of works out in practice.
Hey, just briefly then, just quickly talking about you. I think this is your second book, I believe. So, what's the plans for the future? Any more books? Any ideas for books that you're thinking of writing?
Yeah, I mean, my first book was about sporting mascots, so it's a bit of a gear shift from to go from that to the kind of machinations of states owning football clubs for geopolitical reasons. So who knows what the next one's going to be? I mean, I am kind of thinking about ideas for another one. What I like to write about the kind of well, sort of football culture and the kind of thing, the peripheral things around the game. We did a piece on the Athletic recently about football related songs, and I wonder whether there is something in the kind of cultural crossover between football and music that might be worth doing. But yeah, at the moment, I'm thinking about things. I'm just kind of doing my day job. Because while I wrote this book at the same time as doing my day job, which kind of on reflection, I don't really know how I did, and required a lot of a lot of patience from my wife, for me to be able to do that, both those things at the same time. So the kind of the stress and the impact on my free time, the memories of that are fading just enough now for me to think that doing another one might be a good idea. So I'm not sure. I don't have any concrete ideas or suggestions at the moment, but I'd certainly love to do more books in the future. So, for everyone listening, please buy a copy of the book, which will make doing more things like this in the future much easier for me.
I'll leave a link in the description in regards to where they can buy the book. Nick Miller, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on to the 286 project.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.